What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History.
Fucking shit. Shut your phone off.
It's my iPad. All right. Ready?
Yep.
What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamoda and Danny Abdeljabbar. What's up, brother? How are you?
Chilling, man, as per usual. How about yourself, man?
I can't really complain. Do you know what I just recently watched for the first time?
What?
Inception.
You just watched Inception for the first time?
Yeah, it's one of those movies where it's been recommended so many times, and it was a big hit that I never really got around to watching. And it's funny because I'm a big Christopher Nolan fan. It's Christopher. His brother is Tim Nolan, right? He has a brother who does movies. Well, whatever. I'm a big Christopher Nolan fan, Dark Knight director. And I like his other movie, Dunkirk, and really whatever he puts out. But I had never watched Inception. And I think there's something wrong with me because whenever someone like recommends something or whenever there's a movie that I know I would like, I always intentionally don't watch it. It's very weird.
That's extremely weird.
It's a very weird thing because it has everything that I like about a movie. I love really weird kind of, I don't want to say gimmicky concepts, but it is kind of a gimmicky concept in films. Like I love time travel stuff.
Right. You like sci-fi kinda, you know?
Yeah, like weird concept
alternate
type
reality
movies.
Shit. I'm all about that too.
Like Ex Machina, like AI type stuff. I love Ex Machina.
Yeah. Did you ever watch Man in the High Castle or read it?
No, it's another one of those things where
honestly,
I know
that's right up your alley. And I think I might have recommended it to you a while ago, and it was probably like the reason why you still haven't watched it.
Yeah, probably. Another one is I still haven't watched Stranger Things, and I know that I probably would like that as well.
I still haven't watched Breaking Bad.
Oh, how have you not watched Breaking Bad?
Because by the time I decided that maybe I might be interested in it, it was already like, I don't know, fucking 20 seasons in or some shit like that. And I was like not in the mood to start binge watching something that long. It's a commitment, man.
It is. I got into Breaking Bad by accident, though. I wouldn't have just turned it on like, oh, everyone's recommending this show to me. I might as well turn it on. An episode was on in like the background, and I was like, wow, this is awesome. So then I ended up watching the entire thing. However, I'm very weird about that. If I know I really like something, I won't indulge in it.
So last bit on this. What was your take on Inception? Did you like it?
Oh, I loved it. I thought it was great. I really enjoyed it. For some reason, I was always under the impression that it was going to be since Inception and Shutter Island came out around the same time. They came out with like within a year or two of each other, and they had similar trailers. Leo was wearing a suit in both of them. I kind of just put them together in my head where they were like the same film.
Movie.
And I knew that they were both weird. It obviously has this kind of weird, corny sections and, you know, things that you can criticize, but that's with everything. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, watching that film though in the theaters was just nuts. So
that guy, Christopher Nolan, really does. He is the master at the thrilling build-up moments. Because I don't want to, if anyone hasn't watched it, I'm assuming most people have watched it, but I'll just say the whole segment of the van falling off the bridge into the water. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yep.
I was shitting my pants the entire time. I was like, holy fuck, this is going to end up bad for everyone. And it was just an awesome experience. But my take was I give it 2 thumbs up. You have a nice pair of New York boobs. I'm Lyle. You ever watch that from Chappelle's Show?
I don't recognize that particular.
Lyle. You have a nice pair of New York boobs.
Well, Chappelle's Show's on Netflix now again, so maybe I'll take a second pass. I don't recognize that one.
All right. Let's get into the episode and start talking about Japan.
Yep.
So,
last little bit that actually relates to this. Netflix has a show out right now on samurai, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And I saw exactly one episode, and I haven't been able to complete the rest of it.
So it wasn't very good.
No, it was interesting, but
I watched one episode and didn't turn on the next one.
I think I got distracted or something like that, and then I just never turned it back on. I don't know. It didn't have staying power, but it was weird because like it came up
recommendation.
Pretty much. It came up pretty much right when we were starting doing this series on Japan, and I'm like, oh, this is perfect. I'm going to use this as source material. And I watched the one episode, and I was just like, yeah, this is cool, but like, I don't know, didn't get back into it. I feel like it might, especially after doing all the research for this, it might be using some of the weird, over glorified tropes of a samurai that we'll get into later, but I'll have to start that again and see if that's the frame of reference that they're putting up on samurai.
You're better off looking at some random guy on YouTube than watching like a History Channel or a Netflix documentary on a historical topic. And I'm serious, like you'll find more nuance and more research, or maybe not more research, but a better take and more accurate take from some random YouTuber than you will on a History Channel.
Some random PhD student from God knows where who decided he wanted to make a YouTube video.
Some weird dork who's just loves collecting like origami and samurai swords will have a more educational program than anything that you'll find on Netflix or
from the producers of Netflix.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Netflix makes good other documentaries, but historical documentaries I'm not really a big fan of. But I guess this is part 3. I don't want to say part 3 because then it's a challenging concept. We're trying to make these episodes stand on their own but be part of a larger series. But we're trying to explain the nation state of Japan, specifically the creation of the modern nation state of Japan. In the last 2 episodes, we spoke about mainly the origins of Japan, so prehistory, the Neolithic Age, going to the first migrations, and then the development of the first governments and the court system, and gradually the transformation from a centralized government that copied the Tang Dynasty to a feudal society. And now we're going to make a huge leap. We're actually going to talk about Japan in the modern context. And I don't mean now, I mean when Japan first started going through modernity in the 19th century. And there's 2 wars that defined Japan in the early 20th century. The Sino-Japanese War and the Russo Japanese War. And they win both of them. And
2-time winners.
2 times winners. And this is a shocking moment to the rest of the world because 40 years prior, they were still a feudal society. It's impressive when Japan defeats China. And it's true that the Qing dynasty was falling apart at this time. They were by no means a power in the region. In the 1800s, China had been carved up like a Thanksgiving Day turkey by like Britain and France and Germany and all the rest of the colonial powers,
Portugal,
Russia.
Like
But it was still China. The dynasties of China were always the more impressive civilization compared to either the Japanese imperial courts or the shogunates. And the Qing dynasty was the largest country in the world at this time with over 400 million people. In fact, the Qing dynasty had a larger percentage of the world's population in the year 1900 than they do now. Believe it or not, 25% of the world's population was in Qing China. And now it's like less than 20%. It's like 17 or 18%. Even though their population is like 1.4 billion people, there's just more people.
Different scale. It was just like a proportion of the world's population. It just ate up more of it then.
Yeah. So you can come to a very reasonable conclusion why China loses that war, though, even though they have a much larger population. It's because Japan modernized at a much faster rate than China. So if you guys are not familiar with the history of Japan, just quick crash course. Japan modernizes in the mid 1800s, and what they do is they modernize very, very quickly. As soon as they see Western powers approaching their shores, as soon as they kind of realize that there is a threat out there, they say, hey, maybe it's time to get things like railroads and modern medicine in our society so we can
crazy naval boats and shit like that,
large battleships, so we don't end up like China over there. But they do this thing at an astonishing rate. It takes them about 40 years.
Funny enough, this wasn't the first time that they like revolutionized themselves by copying off of other surrounding or better neighbors. They did this prior when they were unifying under a central government, but I digress.
Yeah, they did the same thing with Tang China. A lot of the origins of Japanese culture, not all of the origins, but a lot. The beginning, the first governments of Japan were greatly influenced by the Tang dynasty systems. Now, so there's that explanation for China. They modernize quicker. However, when Japan beats the Russian Empire, a Western power, one of the great world powers of that time, it became a lot more difficult to figure out exactly what happened. The Russo Japanese War, in a nutshell, Spark Notes version, they're fighting over possessions in Korea, and Japan destroys them in naval battles. It's more of a kind of a stalemate on the ground with their armies, but in the sea, Japan 100% wins the war. And then Teddy Roosevelt is the guy who kind of draws the piece up together and wins a Nobel Peace Prize for it. But
wait, aren't they still technically at war with one another, or is that from a different war? Is that from still World War II?
That's from World War II, when the Soviet Union declared war against Japan.
Just making sure, because they're technically still at war, aren't they?
Yeah, because the Soviet Union declared war on Japan in, I think, about a month before we dropped the A-bomb on them. As soon as Germany surrendered, they declared war on Japan. But it became really difficult to figure out exactly how, what happened. It was kind of like, an expedition. You know how there's like, they'll have like an expedition game between the New York Yankees and like Virginia Tech or something like that,
right?
Like a college team, and they'll be like, "Oh, it's just an expedition friendly,
just for fun."
This was like the college team beating the major league team. It was very, very hard to explain what happened, and the people in Japan and also around the world started looking for answers on how this society was able to pull off this remarkable accomplishment. Like, how could this backwater island be projecting geopolitical power in the Eastern Pacific Ocean? And this is the type of shit that think tanks look into, why do some nations fail and why other nations succeed? What made Japan so special that they were able to modernize so quickly to the point where they're able to not only compete with Western powers, but defeat, a team that wins 11 games a season.
Right.
If you look at them geographically, they do have that advantage of being an island nation, but the advantage comes in where it's harder to invade. But they have the disadvantage of not having natural resources, so you can't really point there. You have to start looking at their history and their culture to see what exactly makes this group of people different. What is the first thing that you think of when you think of Japan, besides tentacle porn?
Fuck. PlayStations, TVs, cheap cars, stuff like that. Maybe samurais.
Yeah. Samurai, Bushido.
Yeah, Bushido. Mm-hmm. That's pretty accurate. It's definitely on my top list of things that I think about when I think about Japan. And that's kind of interesting, and obviously a big part of our topic today, because the samurai are clearly among the most famous of the medieval warriors. They are depicted as pretty dope, but what we found when we were doing our research for this is that not everything you learn about samurai is exactly true. And I think, if you're familiar with the show, we often find some of these weird nuances, especially when we're thinking about like really old, ancient or even medieval situations that don't necessarily have a lot of firsthand accounts or direct sources. But I think it might be important for us to first take a look at samurai from like the History Channel version, just to kind of set some groundwork to basically figure out where the nuances are set up. So the History Channel version of samurai is that they were like an educated warrior, in the noble class of medieval Japan, and they served these military lords called the shogun, and they were kind of like knights from the English royalty, and actually they existed around the same period, which obviously always brings up those questions of who do you think would win in a fight, a samurai or a knight? What do you think?
I don't know. Probably just depends on the individual skill of the warrior. But
come on, you don't think
I'm not really an expert on that, but I'll probably go with samurai.
Yeah.
You know what? There used to be a show, I think it was on the History Channel, where they
probably was, yeah.
I forget the name of the show, but they would run these computer simulations on.
Yeah, it was definitely
warriors.
On the History Channel. I love that.
Or it was on Spike
show.
TV or something like that. They would run these simulations, and they would have like I guess they figured it out how many simulations they had to do between these two warriors to figure out who would win beyond a reasonable doubt based off their computer
it's like
simulations.
Out of 10 battles, who's winning the most?
They would run like 1,000 battles, and they would take all the advantage. I don't know how one does this at all. I'm not smart with computers, but they would take a medieval knight and have him fight a samurai. Or I think there was an episode, it might have been Viking versus samurai, and I think something samurai like that, won. Yeah. But they would have another one like Gladiator versus Comanche.
Yep. That was a good show.
They had one like a Zulu warrior versus a. You get the point. Like, a Spartan or something like that. They would find these weird warriors and match them up because that conversation happens so often. Like, who wins, a Roman legion or a Mongolian horde? Right. We love having those conversations where we're always trying to figure out or compare who's better. And there's probably there's definitely military experts who will have a better take than I will. But it's always
this particular matchup is interesting because it's like in a historical context, it's potentially feasible to match these two up because they were around the same time. So. It's probably pretty feasible to like make that comparison. And it's funny that we make that comparison, especially for myself, because I tend to go on the samurai side if I'm thinking about samurai and like English knights. And it's funny that I think that because I think I've been kind of programmed by popular culture to believe that the samurai are superior in one way or another. And there might be some like actual historical and, anthropological evidence to back that up. But specifically, I want to talk about Bushido, which is roughly the Japanese equivalent to chivalry that the medieval knights had. And the basic tenets of Bushido included things like, mastery of martial arts and loyalty and honor and frugality and shit like that. Bushido literally means way of the warrior. So Bushi is warrior and Do is way. And I think, one of those first written accounts of samurai, or at least warriors that we might in hindsight attribute to be samurai, was in 721. And that's in Japan's oldest book, the Kojiki. And it describes warriors who are really good at swords and, kind of reflect an early view of Japanese virtues. And by early view of Japanese virtues, I mean the more, a Neolithic idea. We talked about that at length in our first episode about the invention of the Japanese people. So I won't go into too much detail there, but later writings about these warriors continued to build on this idea and idealized these types of warriors as kind of like these Renaissance people, like educated poet type slash warrior slash, man of virtue, kind of interesting blend. But these things started building on top of each other. And by the 13th century, we start seeing the Bushi figure appearing throughout Japanese literature. And the Bushi were, again, these educated, brave, reckless warrior type that were, they performed a lot of self-sacrifice. They were very devoted to whomever it is that they served. Samurai here, the word different from Bushi, but the word samurai being like those who serve in translation there. This is where we get that kind of connection between these generic warriors like Bushi and the samurai that we know of today. And this character was portrayed as like an ideal situation in this era of like warlords and feudalism. But what's interesting about this is that there was a pretty long peacetime, from the 1600s to the mid 1800s, and in this peacetime, these warrior people became more than just warriors. They became political advisors. They became leaders, bureaucrats, philosophers, writers. Mostly because what the hell does this? What would a warrior do in peacetime? Other than something else. So they had to figure something to do. And under the Tokugawa shogunate or the Edo period, in that same period, samurai were very, very important figures in the administration under the shogun. And like I said, they had to find, useful way to spend their time. And so this is where the apparent idea of Bushido was codified, but the evidence for this is largely written many, many years later, in like post-Meiji periods, by people who were pretty interested in forming a national identity and like this special kind of code of ethics around Bushido. I'll talk more about that later. But, wrapped up in this like kind of special code of ethics, if a samurai like didn't live up to this, if they failed to do this, they were defeated in battle or they were wounded or something like that, apparently their honor was out, and you had to restore it by committing what's called seppuku, the ritual suicide, just cutting open your stomach and sometimes getting your head chopped off by somebody else. And there were specifically 7 official virtues of Bushido. It was like righteousness and courage and benevolence, respect, honesty, honor, and loyalty. There were some other ones that weren't official but kind of related: piety, wisdom, and caring for the elderly. But basically, by following this code, a samurai would maintain both their quote-unquote honor, but also political power in Japanese society. And this is the History Channel version of what samurai were and what Bushido was. Take it with a grain of salt.
So I guess the interesting question is that you have to ask is, how far do these values actually go back? Because Bushido certainly doesn't seem like something that you can trace back to the 1200s when samurai governments ruled Japan.
Right.
Or when they first... These samurai governments or shogun governments started... Last episode we went over like the origins of feudal Japan, and they start around the year 1200 because the central authority kind of broke up and you have a bunch of military cliques take over different parts of the country and have their own court systems and their own monopolies on violence. But there's so many diverse areas and diverse regions with different codes and ethics. So the question becomes, is there some homogeneous code? Like does Bushido apply to all warriors in Japan? And in reality, what's that?
I said at that time.
At that time. And is there evidence of this Bushido code? Like, is there true evidence of this Bushido code that dates back to the 1200s? So what today we're really interested in exploring is the origins of the samurai and Bushido, and we really asked the question: is Bushido a modern construct? Was Bushido a something that was used as a tool to build a nation state? And I'm reading this book called, and I share this book with you as well, it's called Inventing the Way of the Samurai by Oleg Benesh. That I'm stealing a lot from this, but the concept of this book is that Bushido is a totally modern construct. This is something that I honestly kind of suspected since I've been learning a little bit more about nation states, specifically the way that states will either use or create common value systems to create some sort of national identity. And you have to understand what national identity is. I'm going to pull a quote from John Stuart Mill, the classical liberal. The good old classical liberal, John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill. A portion of mankind may be said to constitute a nationality if they are united among themselves by common sympathies which do not exist between them and others, which make them cooperate with each other more willingly than with other people, desire to be under the same government, and desire that it should be government by themselves or a portion of themselves exclusively. In the voice.
It's funny how the British accent just kind of ramped up in the middle of that.
Yeah. As I was saying a quote, I just I don't know.
Decided it was a good idea.
I got inspired.
Well, you didn't mispronounce anything, to my knowledge, so maybe you should do it more often.
That's the key. That's the key to not mispronounce words. Not drink during the podcast and speak in a British accent. Oh, that's why you're slurring, you drunk. It's night when we do these shows. It's late.
Okay.
Now, let's look at Europe. So we can do some comparative analysis between Japan and European chivalry. The chivalric code that we all know from A Knight's Tale. So in Europe, you have the idea of the chivalric code. And knights operated on a code of ethics and honor and all this other noble stuff. But more importantly, modern day people should practice chivalry. So these Knight's Tales, they do really date back to a pretty far period of time. So the late 1300s is when the Canterbury Tales was written. But during this time, people can't read. So most people are illiterate. This is before the Gutenberg press. This is before the Bible was translated into German. This was a time where most people were in massive amounts of poverty and could not read. The 1300s were a pretty shitty time. Things in the medieval life, they were getting better for the year 1000 to 1100 to 1200. And then there's like a decline in the 1300s, just a massive decline.
Then it sucked.
Then it sucked. It was like back in the 600s. Like it was a shitty time. It was very bad because of most of the plagues and stuff like that were just ravaged everything.
Yeah.
Their version of COVID-19. I guess everyone gets their COVID, right?
Well,
COVID,
not everyone.
COVID, plague, bubonic plague. But in the 1600s, these types of stories become a lot more popular, especially in England. But by this time, when these stories start becoming more popular in the 16, 17, 1800s, there were no knights anymore. People had guns. There weren't, especially in England, there wasn't these feudal societies. There was a monarchy that was starting to create its power. There was a parliamentary system that was being created. The foundations of a central government were in England for longer than most other European nations.
Right.
So these concepts of the European, of the, the British knight, and that's why there whenever you imagine a knight, your knight in shining army, knight in shining army. I knew I couldn't go that long without pronouncing something. A knight in shining armor who rescues a princess from a tower from a dragon, like a smog-like dragon.
I'm gonna save you from the dragon.
I'm gonna save you from the dragon, you wench. But these concepts are used to form a value system within the society. Now, what are the tenets ascribed to Bushido? You listed them below. Benevolence, sincerity, loyalty, courage, all these great things. But all these virtues can be found in these texts that romanticize European knighthood. And this isn't an accident. So what Oleg Binish does in this book, that I really highly recommend, is that he links Bushido to chivalry. So he says that Bushido is directly inspired by the English discourse on the roots of the gentleman in medieval knighthood. So essentially, Bushido is the oriental cousin of chivalry, and it was used for the exact same purpose.
Right. And Bushido, like chivalry, wasn't exactly always widely practiced or even defined, as we're led to believe with this kind of pop history, right? That the unification, the homogeneity of chivalry and Bushido was something that was figured out later, right? We put it together. And the origins of Bushido and its legitimacy are very much debated among a lot of experts and scholars. On the one hand, it sets up, this heart and soul of the Japanese people, even though it, doesn't exactly have a ton of roots in a historical perspective.
I mean, I always imagined that most knights were assholes.
Probably. I mean, they were rich.
On the hand, huh?
Are you kidding me? They were rich. They were definitely the upper class, right? They in order to afford some armor, you had to be rich. You had to be straight up rich. And in order to be a knight, specifically, you had to, be a squire and come up in this kind of fraternity. So you've already got, you're starting off with this kind of chip on your shoulder, I'm better than you kind of deal. And the same thing was pretty applicable to our, highly idealized and romanticized idea of the samurai, right? They were also rich in order to afford all the shit that they had. And they had their own little, hierarchical rankings, and samurai were big shit, right? So yeah, they were probably assholes, because anytime you get a system that ranks people based on their means, their wealth, right, you don't always get a meritocracy out of that. The likelihood is that they're probably mostly assholes.
Yeah, and the important thing is that during Japan's modernization process, a number of thinkers, so when I say thinkers, I mean the intellectual class, so the people who don't have jobs.
Right.
The intellectual class that thinks of all these things are just people without jobs who work at think tanks. They were trying to discover how Western nations had preserved their unique cultures while still becoming world powers. So how do they go from being these, preserving their language and their different cultures that makes them a nation, with how do they build this world power without sacrificing those things that, made them unique and special? And that's what the Japanese were very, very curious. Well, when I say the Japanese, I'm always talking about the intellectual class, as with any country.
The thinkers.
The thinkers. So one of these thinkers is named Ozaki Yukio. Ozaki Yukio. And he is known as the father of the Japanese Constitution. For Japan, the natural place to look was England. Because if you look, England has a lot of similarities with Japan. They had a monarchy. They were both, they were island nations. They both had these rivalries within the mainland. So Japan having a rivalry with China, and then
China.
England having, a really long rivalry with France. Both of these countries had much larger populations than the other ones, and for the most part, larger standing armies. But the other ones had superior navies, and same type of system, same type of loose comparisons that you can make between Japan and their relationship. I mean, Japan wasn't at lifelong war with China during their feudal period like England was, but there's enough similarities where they're like, we should look at those guys for our cultural inspiration. So while Yukio was traveling in England, he encountered the idea of the English gentleman. And what he liked about it...
The English gentleman.
The English gentleman.
English gentleman, you say?
Ooh.
Tell me more about
Mr. Yukio,
English
sit
gentleman.
down. Now I lost it. I lost the English accent. It comes and goes. I'm way better at doing a classless type of riff-raff Englishman. Hey, you bloody bloke.
Cockneys.
You fucking twat. This one time I was I'll never forget this. I was in Amsterdam, and I was talking to this bouncer who was and he was telling me how much he hates British guys. He's like, man, because people, guys from Britain have their stag parties in Amsterdam all the time, and he was telling me, he's like, man, I fucking hate these British kids who come here all the time. And then this British guy comes up, and he's like all fucking piss wasted. He's like, hey, will you let me in, you bloke? And he's like, I just want to fucking get. And he's just cursing, and he's like, the bouncer is like, why can't you people say one sentence without cursing? It's like, all you need to use it and use your toilet. Oh, piss off then. It was just very funny, and it was just very interesting to see how the Dutch, or the people who worked at the bars in Amsterdam, resented the British. But again, we are digressing way too much.
Going off track a little bit. That's fine.
Going off track.
So what about Yukio? Tell me more about him. So he was staying in England for, he figured out this idea of the English gentleman. What about it?
So he wanted to apply the idea of the English gentleman into Japanese society. He wanted to use that concept for state building.
So this concept, obviously, that he's trying to apply, he's not, copying and pasting directly English gentlemanship or even chivalry, because that wouldn't work in Japan. That they don't have knights, they don't have that shared culture, so they use it and they mold it in the name of Bushido. And I think this kind of molding process, like Bushido, has this staying power in Japanese culture from then on, because it's super flexible. Well, we'll talk about that flexible nature in a bit, but basically what you need to know up front is that the idea of Bushido has evolved and changed a whole lot, especially in the last 30 years or so, with the explosion of samurai and pop culture and shit like that. But a couple ways that you can think of it is, politicians, as an example, have been trying to bring back aspects of Bushido or types of Bushido to, as an example, address a, quote, moral education among the youth, like to bring back like a lack of moral education. And some people in the military today want to bring back aspects of Bushido because it helps drum up ideological support for Japanese militarism again, right? Specifically in the South China Sea, in the Sengoku Islands. Is it Sengoku? I think.
And Japan has been building its military. We did a podcast about this a while back, probably well over a year ago, about how much Japan is actually, like the Japanese military industrial complex, how much they actually spend on defense and what they're capable of actually doing. And they're much stronger militarily than you would think.
Yeah,
they are.
they can do some damage, you know. And of course, just to kind of follow that thread backwards, you know, part of why they're able to ramp up that militarism is through co-opting aspects of Bushido, and, you know, drumming up that ideological support. But it also leads to a counterpoint. At the same time, you know, this popular resurgence of Bushido as a cultural ideology in Japan, and it's constantly changing ideas. It honestly brings up fair criticism about its legitimacy, like whether or not it's real.
So a common theme that I discovered when reading Japanese writers from the 19th and 20th century, it's always really fun to read writers of this time period. It's one of those situations where you learn more about that time period than the time period they're writing about by reading those historians. It's very interesting, but they frame the period of the imperial court as very decadent and immoral. A common theme that you'll see with these Japanese writers from the 19th and 20th century who are writing about the imperial court of, you know, from the 700s to up to, you know, the ultimate retardation of the can I say it in that context?
Yeah, of course. That's the correct use of the term, I think.
The retardation of the government, you know, the disintegration of the centralized government.
Right.
Is that they blame its decadence and they compare it to the French court before the French Revolution. So the court system of Louis XVI. They talk about how it was effeminate, decadent. These people lost their, all they really cared about was art and social standings and
silly shit.
They probably, it sounds like, you know, kind of like very modern, you know, super liberal culture, you know what I mean? Like all these social norms that you had to abide by. And, they were more concerned with having that type of polite, super uber polite society that they all lost their kahunas and eventually were disintegrated into a virtuous samurai or shogunate ran government by, you know, these military cliques that got together. And the whole story of, I would recommend going to our last episode if you want to hear it. We didn't actually get too far into it, but the actual disintegration of that state. Danny, you take the ball from me because I'm going to go off on your tangent.
Yeah, sure. So if we're talking about like last episode, I think these bits would probably be pretty important to think about, because I think it helps set up this dichotomy between why Bushido was used in this transitionary period as a way to repudiate the prior, administration, if you will. So a couple things to know about the court system in Japan. So at the time, there was a serious lack of suitable land to distribute. There was a common practice at the time of that the government would give you arable land, give every person in Japan arable land to farm and to do stuff on, and then they would tax you on that land ownership. But they were running out of government-owned land, and as a result, there was a lot of problems. So one of them was that they were overtaxing people, in part because they wanted to keep creating a bunch of Buddhist temples, but also in part just to keep up their lifestyles. They had very decadent lifestyles. So there was a huge taxation problem, on the common people, and then there was a smallpox epidemic, which was crazy. And in order to restart the economy and help people out, they started setting up these new policies which would allow peasants to go and clear brand new land to farm on, and if they did that, they were able to keep the land that they cleared and not pay taxes on that land. And right at that moment, we started seeing the first shift from what we see as state ownership of land to private ownership of land in Japan. And that was super, super duper important because it created a cycle. A lot of this a lot of the issues that they were encountering during this court system was, part of it was mass migration. A lot of peasants, they were moving to more what we would call, quote, like tax-friendly states in Japan. So places that were privately owned. And what this created was really quickly, honestly, was a class of wealthy landowners, wealthy private landowners. And honestly, then those wealthy landowners oftentimes were super interested in the court lifestyle, right? So these wealthy landowners would then go to court, and there was this common practice of absentee land ownership, where the landowners would spend most of the year going to court and doing fancy shit like art and poetry. But somebody had to keep up the land, so they would appoint an estate land manager, and those people would stay behind, and they'd be responsible for basically growing their wealth and keeping the landowner supplied with ample amount of money so they can stay at court and impress their new friends. Again, this is a cycle, right? So we have growing estates and wealth acquired by these private landowners, and they're privately owned, so they required private security, and this strengthened this kind of military class, or what we would now today refer to as the samurai. Lather, rinse, repeat this cycle, and suddenly you've got a bunch of really, really powerful private landowners, and we require a shogunate or a military leader to suppress rebellions in the country. And that's where we're at right now, right? So all of the wealthy and high class people are sitting around, with their thumb up their ass, and meanwhile, all the people on the ground, the real people, value strength, value militarism, frankly.
And that's why they venerated these samurai warlords of feudal Japan over the what they called the decadent lifestyle of the court system, even though that courts during that that period of Japan is when you see a lot of like the foundations of their art and art styles of architecture. A lot of that culture comes through that time period. However, you need martial qualities to create a state. Even though you always want to take the martial side of when you're creating a nation state, like the images to create Germany weren't of some, yodeling boy in the mountains. I mean, it's probably not a great analogy. I'm pulling that out of nowhere, but it's like the Teutonic
That's
Knight.
Hilarious. Yeah,
It's the Teutonic Knight or the Lance. It's not something that's sissy.
Right. It's those who take the land and the power by force.
Because ultimately, when you're building a nation, you need to, what's the most important thing that a nation has is an army, is a military, is their ability to be the sole providers of violence. And
monopoly on violence, as you say.
Monopoly on violence, sole provider of violence in an area. If you don't have that, then you're not a state. Now, the most popular book there's a lot of books, a lot of different literature. Honestly. There's too many to name. But the one that you need to know if you're interested in this subject is it's a book called Bushido, The Soul of Japan by Notobi Inazo.
Pretty good. So Inazo's book is basically like the textbook standard for all things Bushido. It basically formulated and popularized this heavily idealized version of Bushido, and it was this version of Bushido that was adopted and taken up by the Meiji, the Taisho, and the early Showa governments as basically the foundations for their ruling ideology, that basically redirected loyalty from away from feudal lords and towards the emperor. And this served as a kind of unifying ideology, very, very similar to the unifying ideology that we talked about in the earlier episodes of Japan, where we were saying that Buddhism was used as a tool in Japan to unite people. Well, so was Bushido. It was the way that it was a useful tool for them to bring people together.
And don't underestimate the popularity of this book. So this was something that Teddy Roosevelt was reading. He really liked it. This book was written in Japan. This book was written in the United States, written in English, and then later translated into Japanese. And the text from this book is really used by the Meiji government. The Meiji government, if you guys aren't familiar, it's I don't know if I said this already, but it's the government that modernized Japan. Just to be clear, it's the Meiji government is the government that took Japan from feudalism to the modern world. So they're the ones who were responsible for a lot of the transitions that took place in the late 1800s. And in these books, you're not really going to learn too much about the reality of the samurai class. They're not really history books. They're tools to provide legitimacy to the modern imperial state.
And honestly, there are part of what legitimizes these ideas is that there's just so damn many of them. There's almost too much material on the Bushido subject. I think so much so that it's kind of hard to get an accurate fix on which writings are fan fiction and which writings are just trying to justify or promote some kind of national behavior, and which ones are actual legitimate accurate representations of historical events. And what makes it even more complicated is that if you wanted to study Bushido as a concept or as an ideology, it's also super hard to do that because when we talk about Bushido, there's actually lots of similar types of ideologies floating around during that time period that all get lumped together as just blanketly Bushido. A couple of the ones you may or may not have heard of, Budo, which is the martial way, Shido, which is the way of the samurai or the way of the gentleman, depends on the translation. And then there's Hokonin no Michi, which is the way of the retainer, or Otoko no Michi, which is the way of masculinity, which is a funny one, or Haido, which is the way of the soldier. So there's a bunch of these different dos or ways that are kind of simultaneously being talked about in and around this time period. And a lot of the times, a lot of these writers will just kind of take all of those ideas and put them all into one little bucket and call it Bushido.
It's Bushido. When you talk to somebody, and if you're ever talking to somebody about World War II, for example, and you get into why the Japanese were so relentless in battle, I'm listening to Dan Carlin's podcast on Supernova from the East. That's what he calls it. I just started listening to it. I'm a big Dan Carlin fan, and he has a 5-part series on the Pacific Wars in World War II. The way that he describes the Japanese soldiers are like a crazed robot. That's the way that he used that description. They're like the crazed robot whose hand will chase after you destroy the rest of the body. They're fanatics. When you talk to a lot of people about the Japanese soldiers and how they were, why they were so fanatical and why they were so disciplined, or really any of their kind of exaggerated traits that they seem to have, everyone always points to Bushido. Oh, it's because of the way of the samurai they practice Bushido. That also applies to their economic recovery as well. So it doesn't. When you use the term Bushido, and because everyone has this conversation, why are the Japanese so successful? Because they are. They have been a very successful country post World War II,
right?
And even before World War II, but
right. A couple times before World War II,
there was a dark age.
Yeah.
why were they so successful after World War II? Why was there such a huge economic recovery? Why? How did they?
Why were they able to beat the
How did they
Russians?
almost become the largest economy? At one point, they were almost the
Right.
largest economy on Earth. Now they're three, but they're the third largest economy on Earth. They almost overtook the U.S. in the 1980s. How did that happen? We just nuked them, didn't we? Isn't that supposed to prevent?
Take you down a peg?
Yeah, doesn't that take you down a peg? We literally just not only wiped two cities off the face of the country, but we've been spending 4 years or like 2, 3. I forget when they started bombing Tokyo, but firebombing Tokyo for at least 2 years straight with bat bombs and fire bombs, and I mean, there were more people died there than Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. How, after so much devastation and having that country just stretched
Decimated.
so thin, how did they recover from that? Like it's just like one
Bushido.
of those really weird
Right.
comeback stories, and people are like, bro, Bushido, bro, Bushido.
Obviously.
Come on, man. Like, don't you know that these they practice
It's because they know karate, bro.
yeah, they know karate.
Right.
They practice harakiri, man. So it's always where those conversations come up. But it's interesting to paint it in this light that this Bushido concept is not something that is organic to Japanese culture. Because what is really organic to someone's culture? It's like always someone had to think of that idea. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like
someone had to come up with it.
Someone had to come up with that
point.
idea, and in some way it was mass produced to a huge audience where they now believe it and abide by it. And that's what you see with a lot of ideologies, and that's what you see with national identity as well. Because in some ways, national identity is just some sort of ideology. You all have to have some type of common ideology to live in a nation with each other. So I have another quote, another interesting journal entry by the Japanese expert of the Western Japanese expert from the 19th century. His name is Basil Hall Chamberlain. With that name, I bet you know where he's from.
Basil Hall Chamberlain.
Basil. Oh,
He's a Brit.
Basil.
He's a Brit, isn't it?
So he was the big Japanese guy.
No. He was a big Japanese expert, not a big Japanese guy.
The Japanese guy, as in he's the Japanese guy. Not
big into Japanese, isn't it?
But he's the guy who knows everything about Japan at that time period.
He was a neckbeard. He owned a
the white
samurai
guy
sword.
who knows
you
about
know.
Japan. That's what he's known for. Basil! Oh, Basil, stop with your Orientalism.
All right, what did Basil
Your
say?
Oriental thoughts, Basil. You've been spending too much time out east, Basil. All right, so the Japanese are, it is true, commonly said to be irreligious people. They say so themselves. I lack a religious nature, and I have never believed in any religion. The average, even educated European strikes the average educated Japanese as strangely superstitious. The Japanese simply cannot be brought to comprehend how a mere parson, such as the Pope or even the Archbishop of Canterbury, occupies a place he does in politics and society. Yet this same agnostic Japan is teaching us at this very hour how religions are sometimes manufactured for a special end, to subserve practical, worldly purposes. The 20th century Japanese religion of loyalty and patriotism is quite new, for it is pre-existing ideas have been sifted, altered, freshly compounded, turned to new uses, and have found a new center of gravity. I love the way that these 19th
folks
and early
write this
20th
shit,
century writers write. I think they're just better writers.
Yeah.
They just like come off. They're like so much more pungent with their
They're
words.
just like walking thesauruses, you know? Like, they're great.
They'd be great rappers.
Yeah,
today,
they would
right?
be.
It'd be awesome. You take a guy from the late 18th century and say, "Hey, come up with a rhyme." I think they would be very good.
Yeah.
Not only is it new, it is not yet completed. It is still in the process of being concisely or semi-consciously put together. Let me read that again because I butchered that. Not only is it new, it is not yet completed. It is still in the process of being consciously or semi-consciously put together by the official class in order to serve the interests of that class, and incidentally, the interests of that nation at large. Bushido was unknown until a decade or two ago.
Wow.
He writes all of this. This next part he writes in all caps to really drive the point across. The very word appears in no dictionary, native or foreign, before the year 1900. So that is all in
Bushido.
caps.
Right.
The word Bushido. Chivalrous individuals, of course, existed in Japan, as in all countries at every period, but Bushido as an institution or code of rules has never existed. An analysis of medieval Japanese history shows that the great feudal houses, so far from displaying an excessive idealism in a matter of fealty to one emperor, one lord, or one party, had evolved the eminently practical plan of letting their different members take different sides so that the family as a whole might come out as winner in any event, and thus avoid the confiscation of its lands.
Yeah, man, he really kills that. That description of this is honestly pretty spot on, and I think that the fact that the word doesn't even exist in any of the dictionaries or anything like that. I don't know if he actually went through every single dictionary, but just the idea of that it just wasn't even a thing before 1900 is kind of damning for the whole idea.
It's very interesting to read this stuff from the time period, because this was a guy who spent a time in Japan. He was from England. He was, I think he was a professor at the University of Tokyo. I forget his exact academic background, but he was the expert. And hearing reading him talk, reading him observe the changing dynamics in Japanese society is just fascinating. You know what I mean? Like, it really makes you think about our own society. Like doing this stuff and looking into these concepts. Ultimately, my goal is to learn more about our country. You know what I mean? Like what's going on right now, like what's going on in the United States.
To put it into
as
context
far as
for
like
ourselves.
the cultural war and people hating each other's guts all of a sudden, like what's exactly going on? Like what are there has to be some process that is happening, and I'm interested.
It just doesn't feel brand new. It feels like a rhyme of something that's already happened, right?
Yeah, I feel like we'd have better understanding of reading stuff from looking at the past and being like, this country had this problem. But it's interesting to really think about this idea of these
Like this modern construction idea,
invented constructs that are
right,
played off as these ancient traditions.
Right.
Like these ancient
and
traditions.
are venerated as gospel almost,
Yeah. And they're never refuted, really. They're never really refuted.
Well, I mean, they are, they are refuted, but calling Bushido a modern invention in and of itself is hard too, right? It's not like super easy. Like this guy, that you just quoted, I already forgot his name. What was he? Basil Hall Chamberlain. Like it's easy for him because he was like living during the period and he was like considered the expert. But arguments like this and like those, despite how much sense they tend to make and how much like background they have, they just never really caught on as a popular theory, especially not for Bushido. Even though historians like this guy and anthropologists of medieval and early modern Japan, they can't point to a specific ethical or moral system that could be seen as the start of Bushido. There's still this idea that maybe they'll find it eventually, and we're not going to roll it out. So it's a little bit crazy, and it just because like it wasn't very convincing at the time, and there was just this flood of what I would consider to be propaganda that molded Bushido as this like exalted thing, but the question really becomes then, if Basil here is right and it is an invention, Bushido is an invention, who invented it? That's kind of a hard question to answer. I think Bushido's flexibility it's just hard.
See, it's like saying who invented Japanese people or who invented or who invented any of these constructs. Like who invented, you can find like founders of movements. I guess to think of it in like a political context, we can we can agree that the founder of Marxism was Karl Marx. You know what I mean?
Right. It carries his name.
It has his name. So there's like a clear person who has that. You could attribute that value, but like Marxism, and I'm no expert on Marxism or anything. I'm not one of these conservatives who pretends to be like, I'm an expert in all things Marxism. You know how that, ever see those conservative commentators like, I'm an expert on Marxism and I can tell you that the communists are
Here's
coming
why
to your
it never
door
works,
and they're gonna kill you and they're gonna pump your kid with hormones. They're gonna turn Jesse into Jessica. But man, I forgot the point I was fucking making right now. Jesus Christ, I have bad memory. Help me out here. What was I saying?
I don't know, but we were talking about how do we call out who invented these constructs?
Yeah, how do you call out who invented an identity? And I don't think like political philosophies are different, are much different than, but they're not different. See, this is a part where I'm thinking, and I'm not really sure where I'm going with this. Like I'm trying
to build the plane while you fly it. I get it.
I'm thinking on while recording the podcast, so I don't have like a true. I don't know exactly how to explain this because I'm still thinking this process through of who invents or how does a country or a value system get invented, like who invents it.
That's kind of the whole point of this whole series. And I think let's stop thinking super broadly and let's go back to a very narrow example, because I think that'll help us to think about that question and help us to try to answer it. So going back to Bushido specifically, we're having the same problem, right? Who invented Bushido? And as I pointed out, this is kind of a hard question to answer. And part of the reason why it's hard to answer is because like Bushido is kind of not even a homogenous thing. It's not one thing. It's flexible. It's been molded. It's been, it has been around for a long time, but it's also died a couple of times, and then it came back to life again a couple of times. Let's be specific about some of these. So Oleg, the guy who writes the book that we borrow a lot from, he quotes this guy Eric Hobsbawm in saying that the invention of tradition should be expected to occur more frequently when a rapid transformation of society weakens or destroys the social patterns for which old traditions had been designed. So what this effectively means is that during these transitionary periods, which, by the way, we've mentioned a million times, Japan goes through a lot of these, it is easier to develop these kind of social traditions or modern inventions during these transitions, right? Because they're useful during these transitions. And Japan just happens to keep coming back to Bushido and reinventing it rather than coming up with some like brand new thing. Like a lot of these like countries like they go through these different changes. We'll just invent this brand new thing and go with that. Like when we did the episodes on China, we saw every time they invented a new, dynasty, they totally completely different, right? Like a different style of political philosophy, different, culture, lots of different shit. Not Japan. They keep coming back to Bushido and they keep changing it. So here's a few examples of some transitional periods in Japan and how they used Bushido or reinvented Bushido. So between the Edo and the Meiji periods, there's this like nostalgic Bushido that pops up, and they use this as a way to refute the current like socio-political climate. Like think like a MAGA movement for the Edo period Japan, right? They were saying, make Japan great again. It was better in the past, right? It was better during the time of the samurai, and they were saying Edo Japan was you got to remember, Edo Japan, as we said before, was a peacetime period. It was a peaceful period. And samurai at the time got soft. They became politicians. Ultimately, a lot of them became corrupt. So there was this idea of this idealized Bushido, right? And it was an easy layup as an ideology to refute the current samurai decline, right? This is 100% MAGA here, but for Edo period Japan.
Well, something to add to that is that something that's really important to note is that in the 1880s, the samurai class was not popular.
Nope.
Like when
the
beginning transition from feudalism to modernity, they were seen as the average Japanese intellectual would have been embarrassed of a lot of the feudal traits that Japan still had. Right. And they looked at the samurai class as a relic. And they were even causing problems too, because there was resistance to modernity because they were losing a lot of their power. They were losing their spot in the hierarchy train. Like a lot of the samurais became unemployed during the transition to modernity. Now,
yeah, because they didn't have anything to do.
Didn't have anything to do, but they lost like even their political power. So a lot of them resorted to business. That's what the movie. You see the movie The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
That's what that's that whole period.
It's the plot of that movie, right?
That takes place in 1876 or 1877, around that time when the samurai have their big rebellion, and he's I think he's a veteran of one of the wars with Native Americans. I think he fights with General Custer or something like that. And and he has PTSD for raping and killing a bunch of American Indians. So but that whole period. So what's interesting, and I'm going to go on another weird rant. I was actually watching I had that movie on DVD. I loved that movie when it came out. I was a big fan. And I had watched it on DVD, and you know how there's like the director's cut? Where they have like the production of the film and they talk in the background.
The commentary,
The commentary. So the writer of the screenplay was like talking. He's like, what's funny about this film? He's a writer of this too. We're rooting for the wrong people. The samurais were actually the bad guys. They're the ones
Yeah.
who wanted to keep Japan in a feudal society, and there wasn't really anything that noble about like what what the living circumstances they were living under. It was really just they were trying to keep their pattern, their lifestyle. But it makes for great history, or a great movie. And I forget if it was a screenplay or maybe like a historical consultant, because how these history films, these epics, they always have like the historians they bring on board to consult with the project, and then they don't listen to them. They ignore what they
not
say.
at all. They'll be
like, people are accurate if the shut up, nerd.
It's like they'll pick and choose the dumbest things. It'll be like the historian will be like, well, the samurais were actually, the bad guys in this context. And, they wanted to keep the people oppressed. And they did so using their katana. And then the producer's like, what'd you say about katanas? Okay, we're going to go with that. And only that.
Some producer was like, listen, we're looking for dances with wolves and samurai at the same time, because people love samurai and people love dances with wolves. So we want to combine that. We don't really give a fuck who's the good guy or who's the bad guy. We're just trying to
We're making a movie
good
here, okay?
movie. And I agree. To that point, I actually agree.
Yeah.
I loved that movie when it came out, even though I watch it now and I'm like, this shit's not that great. It's not as good as I remember.
Kind of stupid, right? Yeah.
You're like,
let's get back on track, because I could talk. I could talk about The Last Samurai forever. So backtracking a little bit, Bushido in between the Edo and Meiji periods was funny enough. Like they hated the samurai. The samurai sucked, but they were, rather than rejecting samuraiism outright, they were like, you know what? The old version of like the true Bushido code of samurai, that was the real thing. We're gonna take that, and we're gonna ignore these new samurai or these current samurai. They're not the real samurai. The real samurai were before. So we're gonna play with the idea of Bushido, and we're gonna use that as a tool. All right, so here's another one. So we already pointed at some European links in the modern period around the late 1800s. This is actually probably closer to the bit about The Last Samurai. Prominent figures in Japan would travel to Europe and back, and they would look to Europe and look at their systems to learn how to better their own systems. Again, not something new for Japan. They were doing this already, during the Tang Dynasty in China, copying off of China. But one such person and journalist was that guy that we talked about, Ozaki Yukio, right? And he pushed this Bushido line hard, so hard to the Western counterparts as basically Japanese version of chivalrism. And he did such a good job with it that all of the Europeans and even Americans like Teddy Roosevelt, they looked back at Japan and they were like, remember the good old days when like knights were awesome? Japan's doing it good. So it was kind of a circle jerk, like they looked to Europe, copied off of chivalry, or at least amended Bushido to be like this highly idealized chivalry. And then they did such a good job at it that the people that they were copying off of looked back at them and were like, oh man, like we're not doing chivalry right. And it's so crazy. It's literally a circle jerk. It's hilarious. Here's another one. So we talked about really early in the beginning of the podcast, we talked about the Russo Japanese War. And we mentioned, that Bushido was a tool that they use to explain why tiny little Japan is kicking the ass of bigger, more developed nations. Right? Same thing with the Sino-Japanese War against China. Why did they win? Bushido, probably. And
Bushido, man.
Exactly. And this type of Bushido, this was confident Bushido, this was nationalist Bushido, and this was a chauvinist Bushido. You know what I mean? It's like real manly man's Bushido. And they used it for this period.
This ain't your grandma's Bushido.
Exactly. And then by the end of the Meiji period, we see a different Bushido again. It changes again. This time it becomes an ideology that they wanted to spread throughout a ton of different areas. So places like literature, academia, sports, religion. It also becomes a guiding force in military education. And, you know, let's just put it this way. It was used to promote some pretty heinous shit up to and through the Second World War. I don't really know how else to put it that way. But again, totally different type of Bushido, totally different set of ideas. It morphed and became new again. And then it died again, right? But you would think it would just stop there, but it doesn't. During the miracle period, right? This is after World War II when Japan's starting to be on this upswing again. You were talking about this earlier. When Japan very nearly became, you know, the largest economy in the world, we see Bushido again explode in popularity. Where pretty much at this point, everybody's heard of Bushido, right? It's in all of our culture. It's in all of our, you know, all of their culture, all of their, you know, writings, things like that. Even if like you take a history class, they're still talking about that shit. You know, History Channel's still talking about it. The Netflix is doing a documentary about it. You know, like everybody talks about it like that. And this like highly idealized pop culture Bushido. And this is something that some Japanese people embrace as a form of national identity, and some Japanese people shy away from as almost like an awkward, like, no, that's not, like it's overshadowing the real non-martial Japan. But I guess all of this is to say there are so many different kinds of Bushido. It has changed in so many different ways. It umbrella lumps in so many different ideologies that probably existed around the same time. It probably didn't like the word for it probably didn't exist before 1900. There are so many questionable things about Bushido that makes you think like it's bullshit. Like it's not real, you know? Nevertheless, it's very, very much real. And it's real because the Japanese people made it and invented it and used it at different stages of their development.
I guess that makes it real.
Kind of does.
I love how we have referenced, we went almost to full circle with Ken Watanabe movies.
I love Ken Watanabe.
Because he was the Sato in Inception.
Mm-hmm.
And he was
the samurai. I forget his name.
The samurai, the old wise samurai in The Last Samurai.
Perfect.
I think
perfect. It is all perfect.
What do you want for yourself? All right, I think we have an episode here, don't we?
Yep. Yeah, I think that's about it. That's all I want to talk about.
Let's finish it. I have an idea. Why don't we do a Patreon exclusive for On the Last Samurai? Because I think that would be a fun little combo to have. Would you be down to do that?
Yeah, I'm down. I'm going to have to watch it again. But
all right. So on our Patreon, we are going to just have a further conversation about The Last Samurai, and it will probably be a little bit more bizarre. I encourage you guys to join it. We have another bonus episode on the relationship between the early influences on China on Japan. We're adding more content there, and we're also giving you access to our Slack, which is a fun community where we talk and shoot the shit, and it's fun. It's a fun time. If you enjoy the episode, rate and review the podcast. Rating and reviewing the show is the number one way to help us grow. We really do appreciate it when you rate and review. It's super easy. Just press the 5-star in the top right-hand corner of your Apple app. If you don't have Apple, then just share it with tell your friend. Just tell your friend, hey, I'm listening to a podcast called Bro History, and it's pretty good.
You'll love it.
You'll like it. Don't say love it. Just say you'll like it.
You will find it entertaining for about an hour and a half.
You may not learn anything, but you'll
like it.
You'll listen to something. It will kill time.
It's a great way to kill time.
Great way to kill time. But yeah, rate and review the podcast. It is the number one way to help us grow the show. We really do appreciate the reviews. We've had like almost 60, almost 70 reviews in the past 3 months. So thanks, guys, for continuing to do that. And then just tune in. Keep on tuning in to us. We love having you. We love having you. We love doing these shows, and your continued attention and viewership is not the right word. Your continued you continuing to listen to this show is awesome, and we really do appreciate it. Anything else to say?
Nope.
All right. Thanks, guys. Future episodes, we will be tackling even more concepts of nation building in Japan. Can't wait to have you there, and we are out. Peace.
Peace.